Okay, so base coats are done, and now it's time to start looking at doing some shading. That's where the real fun comes in. So I'm going to start with the cloak, and originally what I was going to do is I have a pre-made wash here from Army Painter called Dark Tone, or it's I'm sorry, Blue Tone. And I'm going to attempt to use this to see if I can draw out some of the darker areas by applying this. So see if we can get some recesses, things like that. You can create your own washes, and you can do that by adding water to whatever paint you're using until it has a consistency where it is kind of runny but not that runny. You don't want it going all over the place. You want to make sure that it sticks to where you're trying to apply it. I'm going to be using a combination of a couple techniques with this. In this case, I'm actually going to just brush it on, but you can also do something called pin washing, which is where you go through and apply it to individual areas. I'm just brushing this all over. So it's going to take the tone of the cloak down a bit. But if you notice, it is gathering in the lower areas of the sculpt, and that is really where we want this to be. That is going to be our shading. Now it may not look like a whole lot now, but once it dries, it should make some pretty decent impact here. And pin washing is much like stippling from the standpoint of you're really placing the wash as opposed to letting gravity take it where it needs to go. Can be very helpful if you don't want the wash running everywhere. Gotta make sure we get the inside of the cloak too. And you can be liberal with this. Don't work it too much because you can literally just wipe it away, and then you've lost your detail. Okay, so I'm going to place that. And if you feel like the wash, you didn't get enough coverage the first time through, you can always go over it again. I try and get the fur around his bracer. Washing is very helpful. As a matter of fact, you can, in a lot of cases, depending on the type of miniature you're painting, a wash can actually be basically all you do. Applying a series of washes can really accentuate detail. And I think you can probably see that already. It's really starting to sink into those recesses. So my idea with the cloak is to go ahead and do a darker wash, and then I am going to actually do a dry brush technique on it to catch the raised areas and give it some highlights. So I'm going to have to wait for that to dry. So when it comes to the actual flesh on him, I'm going to create a shade, and I'm going to show you how to do that, or how I do it. I'm not sure. I do actually have a wash that I could use on here. But that being said, I wanted to kind of do it on my own so you could see how I do it. So I'm going to take a drop of the base color, which is Warrior Flesh. And then I'm going to take a darker shade. So you don't want to go with a, well, in some cases you can go with a black. I would not go with a black in this particular case. I'm going to try and find something that is darker, but not too dark. That actually doesn't look too bad. I'm going to try this and see. So I'm going to mix a drop in of this as well, which is rich leather, to see if I can get a shade that I can use for my shadow. Mix that together. So what I'm going to be looking for are areas that would be shaded. So any recessed areas, I'm going to try and hit with this. So right under his pec here. Right here in this cut for the muscle. Put it right in there. I'm going to put it along the side here, because his arm is going to be creating some shade there. And then because I want to give him a little bit more of a belly, I'm going to go ahead and do a line of this along the belt line. And by doing this, when I highlight the upper area, it's going to give him a little bit more of a rounder shape. There is this area up here, which I'm going to go over again. This area in his armpit. This area, see where the cuts of his shoulder and bicep are? I'm going to put some in there. I'm going to put some on the side of his body here, because that would be shaded. I put some in this indentation where his bicep would be, and on the inside of his arm here. And then we have his legs. There are these indentations here for the muscle groups. I'm going to go ahead and fill that in. I'm going to shade the other side too, so you get that muscle cut here. Same thing over here. I'm going to get along this side. I'm going to get along this side on the inside of his leg. And on the side of his knee. Stipple some of that stuff in there. Stipple some a little down here. Again, anywhere you think would be shadow. Or a better way to say it would be anywhere that you're eventually going to want to accentuate with a highlight. There's a little area in here where little groove there. I'm trying to get a little bit in there. Fingers, you want to try and see if you can get it in between the fingers if you can. That can be tough. Don't kill yourself, but see what you can do. The highlight is going to really help bring out the fingers as well. Just watered this down a little bit. It's a little thick. I need it to flow just a smidge. Especially when it comes to fingers and toes. I don't want to try and have to get every indentation. I want it to kind of flow in there almost like a wash. I'm actually going to switch to a 000 brush for this because I think it's going to work out a lot better. I happen to have one right here. And this brush is dry, and so it's going to give me a super fine tip. Sometimes I use brushes like this just because I want that tip to be nice and pointy. It will be when it's wet, but sometimes when it's dry it's much easier to place paint. Okay. Alright, let's see, anywhere else we want to do this. As long as I got my 000 brush out. I go back in under his armpit again. Make sure I get all that. We're going to want to do the back of his neck. So the back of his neck is definitely going to be in some form of shadow, I think. And that's really going to come out when we apply our highlights. I'm going to put a little bit of this darker shade inside his ear canal if I can get it in there. Okay. I'm going to put the shade, I'm going to actually do it inside his mouth here. Just to get some color down. That's good. With the plates, I'm going to go ahead and try a dark wash. And so there is dark tone from Army Painter, which I'm going to try. And in this instance, I'm going to try and do some pin washing. Just drop it into these areas in between if I can. In between the plates, accentuate that. Now a lot of times I'll use darker wash over metal anyway to take the shine down, because very rarely do people have brand new armor on that hasn't seen combat or scratches or anything like that. I go through and take care of these plates in between. And I'm going to hit the plates themselves with a little bit of wash just to take down some of the shininess. I'm also going to use this darker tone on the gray undergarment. That we are painting. While I have this out, I'm going to go over any metal that I have out. Again, just to knock down the shine a little bit. Especially a weapon you'd think would be pretty scuffed up. And this wash is going to settle into some of the dents that we have in this, which will really bring out some great detail. Oh, well, I got some on the silver, which I was going to go over anyway, so no big deal. I'm really trying to make sure that it does settle in some of these crevices. Okay, I think that's going to look really good. We do have a buckle up here that I want to make sure that I hit with a little wash. I think what it's going to do is bring out the indentations in that buckle and make it really look like something as opposed to just kind of a blob of metal. Okay, same thing on the metal here. I'm going to go over the top of this. I'm going to go over on the silver. I am also going to use this exact same wash on these cracks that we have in the shield. And around the edges. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to get a little bit more of this wash. I'm going to do the inside of the shield because that's really going to highlight the grain. That's a little bit more than I needed. Switch brushes. So if you take a look, once I start dropping that in there, you'll notice the grain just explodes. See how nice that highlights now? Once that dries, the light won't be quite as bright, but it's going to look really good. Okay, so now that we have the gray down here done, I'm also going to do the black wash over this area. And see what it reveals. Try not to get it on flesh and things like that unless you're doing a black wash on flesh. looks good. I'm going to wash the handle here. I thought that was wrapped with something. Or maybe some sort of cloth, or who knows. Skin. So I keep applying the black wash around the miniature where I think it'll do some good. It's amazing what a dark wash can do to bring out features within a miniature. And you can make a wash out of any color that you have by thinning it out and applying it. I'm using it over the pouches as well, kind of bring down some of those colors and highlight some of the ridges. And also going through and reapplying some of that to the leg wraps to continue to settle in those folds. Okay, so looking at the cloak, our results aren't quite as dramatic as I'd hoped. So I'm going to attempt another blue tone wash and see if we can get some better detail. The problem with doing washes like this is they can tint the base coat down, but I think with the highlights that we're going to do, it should be okay. Okay, I think that looks really good. Yep, that's much better. See that? So I tried to do some fancy pin washing and that didn't quite work out, and if you notice the blue is starting to get down into his neckline, I will correct that as well by simply taking a brush that is dryish and throwing it down there and pulling it out. Just try to absorb that if you can. That's the great thing about washes. They're relatively easy to clean up. If they run somewhere, you can dab them with a dry brush and pull them right off the surface. I am going to move right into highlighting. So the first thing I'm going to work on highlighting is his skin. And so it's a reverse of what you would do if you're going to create a shadow. You're going to take what you have here and try and lighten it. So I'm going to find a tone that's a bit lighter. Maybe like that. And that's not exactly the best representation, but so I'm going to go ahead and mix those two together. I'm going to wipe off my palette because I have a lot of possibly wet paint on here and I don't want to get it all mixed up. Alright, so I'm going to do a drop of my base color. And I am going to do a little bit bigger drop of the lighter color. Oh, and that is all schmeckened up. Yeah, sometimes the paint dries around the tip and you can get that into your paint and then it causes some problems. So try and keep the tips of your bottles clean, or be aware of it at least. Okay. Let's go ahead and see what this looks like. Let's take a look and see. That might be okay. I think I'm going to bring it down just a little bit because I think it's a little too stark here. Put another drop in there. So I went with a 2 drops of Warrior Flush and 2 drops of Scholar Flush, which is, again, these are all Reaper paints. And let's see what that's going to look like. Looks pretty good. Okay. So now when we go to apply this, we're going to be applying it to raised areas or areas where we think we're going to be seeing some lighting. So for instance, the bridge of his nose, his cheeks, his forehead, and a little bit of the top of his head. Same thing with his pec right here. I'm going to apply a little bit to the top of his muscle. I'm going to apply some along his stomach here in a curved fashion. So I want that to be highlighted. Again, I want him to be a little round. Same thing here. Top of the muscle. Top of the muscle. Do a little bit right here on his wrist. And then I'm going to go through and for the fingers, I'm just going to go ahead and lightly drag my brush across the fingers and the thumb. And that way, I'm not taking all of my shading off, just literally highlighting the tops of the fingers. Same thing with the toes. I go through and highlight those. Same thing here. Okay. Looks really good. Now the last part that we really have to worry about are his legs. And I am going to make sure that his kneecap is highlighted. As well as the upper part of the muscle. Okay. Do I need to do anything behind his arm? Maybe a little bit here. Okay. So I know I mentioned this in my tools video. I wanted to show you how it works, or at least how I use it. As I mentioned, there's like a cream in there. And what I do is I do a couple drops of water. And a couple drops of water and get that a little moist. And then I take my brush and I just start to work it in there. So this brush had a bunch of blue in it, and you'll see the blue starting to come off here. Zoom out a little bit so you can see that. So you see the blue starting to come off. And you just kind of run around there for a little bit. It will condition your bristles and clean them. And so now I have a bunch of ick on there. And all you have to do is run that through some water and dry off your brush, and it's good to go. In some cases, people will leave this on their brush to help condition it, sometimes depending on what type of paint you're using. I would imagine you could probably do that. It's not going to hurt. Once you throw it in the water, it'll clean it up. But I just normally clean them up right away. Okay, dry it off. And there you go, clean brush. Ready for your next use. So for the cloak, I'm opting for this lighter blue color, which is pretty stark in comparison to the darker base color that we had. But I'm going to be very, very gentle applying this, just so I get the very, 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 very tippity tops of the miniature. So I'm not going to do too much. Dry brush, nice and clean. I cleaned it last time we were talking. Okay, let's see how this is going to work out. Okay, just very quickly along the top edge. I'm going to leave this area down here, maybe right there I'll do it. This area down here a little darker because of shadow. I'm going to try and hit a little area here, a little area here. His shoulders, try to avoid his face. Maybe a little on his arm if I can get that without going crazy. What do you think? Looks pretty good, I think. Got his shoulders. And all that wash did was really allow this highlight to shine, no pun intended. Same thing down here. Very gently around the hands so I don't get a bunch of blue everywhere. Yeah, I'm really happy with that. That looks fantastic. Don't do too much. I'm going to stop. Because you start doing too much and all of a sudden it becomes one base color. Pretty good. So we are going to take a look at the wraps on his feet here. And I'm going to use a lighter gray to highlight some of the higher areas. So for instance, the edges here, I'm just kind of dragging along the edge. The tops. Same thing here. Edges. Looks like we have some blue there. But I can go right over. I was going to highlight that anyway. Edge right here. Same thing there. There's a little edge highlight there. And now I use a side brush technique just to see if I can grab any of the raised areas. Make sure I get this area right here. And then there are folds here, and I want to get the edges of those folds. Just lightly dragging it across. Same thing there. Take a look and see if there's anything similar like that over here. Looks like I got most of that. The hilt. Just lightly drag it across the hilt. See if I can catch any raised areas here. Oh, I think I kind of screwed that up. So I'm going to show you how to correct a screw up. I was trying to just drop a little bit of paint on here and I dropped a whole bunch. So I'm going to go through and dilute that. Now this doesn't work for everything, but if you notice, some of that paint came right off. Dilute it again and then absorb it off the surface. Make sure it's not running anywhere where it shouldn't be. And I think we got most of it. So as you take a look at the skin, you'll see it's kind of blotchy, right? We have our shadows that we painted, and then we have our highlights that we painted, and while it looks odd, you can see the contours of the muscles and all this other stuff. The way that we're going to fix that is we're going to use something that's called a glaze. And it's your base coat thinned out just enough to where it's not quite a wash, and it has some pigment to it, so it's going to set and help blend those areas in together. So it's not quite as obvious that they're different colors. Part of what I think painting is it's illusion. You're creating the illusion of shadow and highlights. You're creating the illusion of contour in some cases. So glazes really help hide that magic that you're trying to produce. So as we wait for the cloak to dry, I went back over the shield with a dark wash. I didn't like how everything was setting, so I went through and did it again. Hopefully that will settle a bit better. The great thing, washes are thin, so I mean they're not going to build up a lot. They're not going to take away a lot of definition, and you can reapply them as needed. So what we're going to deal with now is his skin. So you can see there are some very obvious highlights and shadows in his skin. And what we're going to do with that is we're going to go ahead and do what's called a glaze. And Citadel actually has some paints that will kind of do all this stuff for you. I've never used them, so I just create my own. You don't want it to be so heavy that it covers up the paint that you lay down. You want it to be rather translucent, so that way it will still show through what you've done on the miniature from your shadows and your highlights, and just try and even out the tone a little bit. So I'm going to put a drop of Warrior Flesh on here. And I'm going to start with probably about 3 drops of water. I'll start with 2 just to make sure. You can always thin it further. You can't unthin it, if that makes sense. I'm going to get my piece of paper over here and run it. Now I have some colors here already on this that I was testing. You want to make sure if you're using a glaze that you can see the color underneath. You don't want it so thick that it covers it up. I think that should be okay. As you see it start to dry here, you bring this over so you can see it. As it starts to dry here, you can still see the blue underneath. So you want to add some tone, but not enough where it's going to ruin our shading. So I'm going to go ahead and run this over the entire miniature from the skin standpoint. And this is like a wash from the standpoint of it's a much thinned down paint, so be careful that it doesn't you see where it automatically ran up into some crevices that I probably didn't want it to be at. But again, one of the benefits of having a watered down paint is it's relatively easy to clean up. Dry brush, stipple that off. And you should be good. Just catch it before it dries. And because it is watered down, it's going to take a little bit to dry. So I'm not sure if you can see the difference here. The gradients between the two, between the shadow and the highlight, are a little bit more muted. And that's really what we want. As I mentioned before, painting miniatures is very much an optical illusion. You're creating something that's not really there. You're creating a light source by adding shadow and highlights. And we're illusionists. Not to bring up drag queens again, but drag queens are very similar. They create illusion. A smaller nose, a higher cheekbone, and they do that all through shading. It's actually pretty amazing. It's a master class in how to apply color and contour and shadow, honestly. You probably learn a lot watching some makeup tutorials too. Sounds kind of funny, but it's true. There's a lot of contouring going on there. So I'm going to go over this one more time here. I'm going to let it sit because I think I'm probably going to have to go over it one more time. I think it's just a touch too thin. But 2 thin coats will probably be pretty good. I'm mopping up a little excess that I'm seeing here. Didn't really do anything on his heels. Back of his leg. Okay. So I'm going to let that sit for a minute, and we'll come back and apply a second coat. Okay, so we've let this sit for a minute and dry a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and reapply a coat of my glaze. Also be aware that your glaze is going to dry out. And when that happens, it becomes less and less like a glaze and more like a paint. And so you're going to see a lot more tint happen. So be aware of that. You can choose a small area to test it out on to make sure it's not too thick. It's easier to correct a small area than it is a big one. Now if you notice, the paint is being drawn up into these crevices in the cloak. That's not a bad thing. And that's the reason why a lot of painters, myself included, tend to work with a little bit thinner paints, because the paints end up doing the work for you. They find all the little nooks and crannies to hide in, and it doesn't require you to go through with a 000 brush and do all that stuff. The one thing that I'm seeing here is that it is running along the side of this cloak, which is going to ruin that line. So I'm going to go through and just pull it off with a brush. Pull it off. Bob Ross style, happy accidents, right? Okay. There's still a little bit right here with his leg that's a little chunky. I'm going to go ahead and apply some more glaze there. Apply it a little more thickly so that way hopefully it starts to even that tone out. I may have to go over his leg a couple times because that's a pretty stark contrast there. We'll see. I am also going to apply the glaze to his head. Totally forgot about him and his head, so I'm going to go through and do this. Head's important. We want to make sure not to screw up his gorgeous eyebrows that we work so hard on, or I work so hard on. I use the term we a lot because I think we're all in the same room doing this together. I'd like to think that. Nothing better than painting as a community. Okay, I think he looks pretty good. His face looks pretty good. A little too much there. I'm going to pull that off. Okay. Not sure if his hands still need a lot there. I don't think they do. This line that I put in his stomach to give us some highlight is a little problematic. I think I was a little too heavy on that, so I'm going to try and even that out a little bit. Now we're starting to get down to the nitty-gritty, finer details of this miniature. So there are little, it looks like rivets in his armor. I'm going to try and set those apart by using another metallic color. Again, a 000 brush. Just a quick touch. Really trying to keep the tip of the brush super fine. I don't want to over accentuate, because if I do, I'm going to end up getting it everywhere, and it's going to be all over the plate of the armor, and so I'm just trying to touch it. These are those details that can really set things apart, and sometimes they can take a long time. Take your time, take your comfortability level. If you don't feel like doing something like this, then don't do it. Practice on something. But again, it is only paint, and if you mess something up, you can always go back over it. But if you take a look, it really does an amazing job for the depth of the miniature. Just the smallest little detail can bring amazing results. That one may have been a little bit too much right there, but we'll see. I'm going to do the rivets in the shield. And while I have this out, there are some little rivets here on the outside that I'm going to try to fix. I originally did those in gold, and then I just abandoned that whole thing. I got too much there, you see. I'll go through and clean that up at some point. Okay, so yeah, I definitely got too much right there. I'm going to go over that with a wet brush and see if I can squeegee that off. Still wet. If not, worst case scenario, what I have to do is go back over that with another base coat, which I can do right now. It's not going to kill anything. That shield was nut brown. Again, before all of this, I took a look at my paint rack app, and it helped me remember all the things that I used. So I'm going to go back through, and this is a technique that you can use. I use a lot, which is basically going back through and painting in behind something. So rather having to go through with that 000 brush, I just follow in with a darker base coat. Makes it a little bit easier. So we'll see how that turns out too. So I've been cleaning up the miniature a bit. I'm pretty happy with where it's at. Things can always be tweaked, but as I mentioned earlier in the video, I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. I wanted to go through some of the techniques, and normally for me, it could take me up to a week to paint a miniature because I get really persnickety about things. But in hopes of just kind of concluding this introductory first video, I am going to attempt to do his eyes, which is really the last thing that needs to be done. So his eye sockets were colored back into the normal base color. I leave them dark for a couple different reasons. One of them to help me reference eyebrow line, cheeks, and nose differentiation. Now that that is done, those elements are done, I'm actually just going to go ahead and try and paint the eyes in. I'm going to use an off-white color called bleached linen rather than a stark white, which I think is kind of weird looking. And the rest of this video is sped up because the process of doing the eyes was very frustrating and not incredibly successful. I'm not very good at them, and I'm still trying to figure those out. And it seemed like no matter what technique I used, they just didn't come out right. One of the things that I did find out doing this was that it was a little bit easier to go through and put the actual eyeball color in there. And then what I would do is I would backfill with the base coat to fill in the area around the eye to get that circular area. It was a little bit easier than trying to do that with a brush. So I was a little messy in the beginning, got it places where it didn't need to go, and then I went back in with a 000 brush and corrected that by, again, backfilling in with a base color. We are having some weird camera issues with this too, trying to get those details. Autofocus wasn't working very well. So needless to say, it was a very frustrating shoot, but I'm glad I tried. And at the end of this video, you'll be able to see exactly what he looks like in his entirety. I was unable to get pupils within his eyes, so they're just kind of white balls, and that's it. I will probably go back and try it at some point, but I didn't want to waste everyone's time with me going back and forth, screwing things up, having to clean them up. And again, some people may like watching that. I just didn't want to do it for at least the first video, considering it's running almost over an hour. Now that I've gone through some of the base techniques, now when I go through and make videos, I won't have to go through and explain in every detail what I'm doing. So they should be much faster and more entertaining. If you know someone who is a beginning painter or somebody who wants to start painting, by all means share the link to these videos with them, and hopefully they can learn with me as I make mistakes and goof things up and make fun of myself and all sorts of stuff. So thanks again for watching. We're going to wrap up with painting the base of the miniature. And normally that's not as big a deal to me, but for a lot of people, bases are hugely important. They go through and they decorate them with various elements. They put actual sand on them and all sorts of things. I did not plan ahead for that, so trying to do a base like that after the fact would be difficult because I'd have to prime all that area. So if you're going to do a base and you want to add some elements to it, make sure all that stuff is added before you prime, and that we can prime all of it together. I'm just going to go through and do a brown on the actual base and fill all that in, and I'm going to do the ring around the bottom in black, and hopefully that looks good and it'll be a nice finish to the miniature. Thanks again for following me through this entire process. This was an entertaining experience for you. I know it was for me. Thanks again for watching, and paint fearlessly.